He aimed for the puddle. That's what you need to understand. This wasn't an accident. Marcus didn't lose control of the wheel or misjudge the distance. He saw her standing there at the crosswalk, recognized the shape of her shoulders even from 20 feet away, and turned the steering wheel just enough to send a wave of filthy rainwater crashing over her body. His girlfriend sitting beside him didn't gasp in shock. She laughed. She pulled out her phone and started recording as the muddy water soaked through Claire's coat, her dress, her shoes, dripping down her face like humiliation made liquid. And Marcus, the man who once promised to love her forever, leaned out the window of his black Mercedes and shouted 3 words that would cost him everything he'd spent the last 4 years building. Stay in your lane. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have known because arrogance makes people blind to details that don't serve their ego, was that the woman he'd just drenched in front of a crowd of strangers was no longer the quiet teacher he divorced when her usefulness ran out. Claire wasn't powerless anymore. She wasn't invisible. And in exactly 47 minutes, Marcus would walk into a conference room to pitch the deal that would save his dying company, only to discover that the billionaire investor he'd been chasing for 9 months, the man whose signature stood between Marcus and total financial collapse, was married to the woman he'd just told to stay in her lane. This is a story about what happens when cruelty meets consequence in the worst possible place. When the past you tried to bury shows up, holding all the cards, and when you realize, far too late, that some people you underestimate are just waiting for you to reveal exactly who you are when you think nobody important is watching. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The rain had started 20 minutes earlier. The kind of October rain that turns city streets into mirrors and makes everything smell like wet concrete and regret. Claire had been standing outside Hamilton Capital Group waiting for her rideshare when the black Mercedes appeared, slowing down instead of speeding past, like a predator circling something wounded. She didn't recognize the car at first, didn't recognize the man behind the wheel until the water hit her with enough force to knock her back against the glass building behind her. The cold was immediate and shocking, mud soaking through layers of clothing that had cost more than anything she owned during her marriage to Marcus. Her phone slipped from her hands and cracked against the sidewalk. Her carefully styled hair collapsed against her face, and for just a second, just one terrible second, she was 28 again, standing in their apartment while Marcus packed his things and explained with infuriating calm that he needed a partner who matched his ambition, not someone content to teach middle school English for $42,000 a year. The Mercedes hadn't just splashed her and driven away. Marcus had stopped the car, reversed slightly, positioned it so she could see his face clearly through the open window, so she would know this wasn't random, so she would understand he'd recognized her and chosen humiliation deliberately. The woman beside him, blonde and polished, and wearing the kind of confidence that comes from never having been discarded, had her phone out, capturing every second of Claire's destruction. Their laughter mixed with the sound of the engine revving, once, twice, 3 times, each roar punctuating what they'd just done with the kind of cruelty that needs an audience to feel complete. Stay in your lane. Marcus's voice carried across the rain-soaked plaza with perfect clarity. The same voice that used to whisper he loved her, the same voice that had gone cold and clinical when he'd handed her divorce papers and explained she wasn't the kind of wife a man builds an empire with. Claire stood there, dripping onto expensive concrete, her hands shaking not from cold, but from something that felt like rage compressed into absolute stillness. Around her, strangers pretended not to notice, their eyes sliding past her humiliation, the way people ignore anything uncomfortable that doesn't directly threaten them. A businessman hurried past holding his briefcase over his head. A woman in running clothes jogged by without breaking stride. Nobody stopped, nobody asked if she was okay. Nobody challenged the man in the Mercedes who was still sitting there, still watching, still savoring what he'd done like it was a victory worth celebrating. Then the car roared away, disappearing into the underground parking garage of the very building Claire had just exited, and she was alone with her shattered phone and ruined clothes and the kind of memory that burns itself into your nervous system. She could have cried. Part of her wanted to, but instead she pulled her coat tighter, straightened her spine the way her mother taught her when she was 7 years old, and walked calmly to the corner where her car was waiting. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, didn't ask questions when she climbed into his pristine back seat, dripping mud. He just handed her a towel, turned up the heat, and drove her home in silence that felt like mercy. Claire sat perfectly still, watching raindrops race down the window, her mind already moving past shock into the cold calculation that comes when you realize revenge isn't something you plan. Sometimes it just arrives on schedule, dressed in expensive suits, begging for what only you can give. 4 years earlier, Claire believed marriage meant partnership. She'd believed love meant supporting someone's dreams, even when your own got smaller to make room. She'd believed Marcus when he said her steady teacher's salary was keeping them afloat while he built Hammond Solutions from nothing, that her faith in him mattered more than any paycheck, that they were a team working towards a future they'd share equally. She'd been wrong about all of it. Marcus hadn't wanted a partner. He'd wanted an investor who didn't require equity, someone to pay rent and groceries and student loans while he poured every dollar into a tech startup that kept almost succeeding but never quite breaking through, someone who'd come home exhausted from managing 30 teenagers and still have energy to proofread his presentations, celebrate his small wins, absorb his enormous frustrations when funding fell through or clients went cold, someone who'd shrink herself small enough that his expanding ambition had room to breathe. For 6 years, Claire had played that role perfectly. She'd transferred to the school district with the lowest pay because it was closer to his office. She'd skip dinners with friends because he needed her to network at industry events where everyone talked about disruption and nobody asked what she did for a living. She'd watched him become fluent in a language of confidence and vision and calculated risk, while she stayed fluent in lesson plans and parent conferences and how to stretch $70 across a week of groceries. And then Hammond Solutions got its first real contract. Not huge, but enough. Enough to hire 2 employees, enough to move into actual office space instead of working from their apartment. Enough that Marcus started looking at Claire differently, like she was a placeholder he'd outgrown, like her usefulness had expired now that he could afford to pay someone else to believe in him. The divorce happened quickly, clinically. Marcus had presented it like a business decision, sitting at their kitchen table with paperwork already prepared, explaining that he needed a life partner who understood the world he was entering, someone who could stand beside him at the kind of events where his success would be measured not just by revenue, but by perception. Claire had wanted to argue, had wanted to scream that she'd built this foundation he was standing on, that every risk he took had been cushioned by her safety net, that he wouldn't have survived the lean years without her subsidizing his dream. But the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't sad. He wasn't conflicted. He'd already moved on emotionally and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. She'd signed the papers, moved out of the apartment they'd shared, started over in a tiny studio that smelled like someone else's cooking and cost half her salary. And for 6 months, she'd believed the story Marcus had written about her, that she was small and stuck and destined for a life of comfortable mediocrity, while he soared into a future she couldn't reach. If you've ever been underestimated or humiliated, type "I'm still watching" below. This story is for you. Then she'd met Jonathan at a conference, not a tech conference or a networking event, just a regional gathering for educators where she'd been invited to speak about literacy programs in underserved communities. He'd been there because his foundation funded those programs, because despite having more money than most people could conceptualize, he still showed up in person to understand where his resources went. They'd talked for 20 minutes about teaching philosophy, then an hour about how systems fail the students who need them most, then 3 hours over coffee that turned into dinner, where Claire forgot to perform smallness and Jonathan forgot to perform wealth, and somewhere in that conversation they'd both realized they were talking to someone who saw them clearly. Jonathan hadn't been looking for a wife. Claire hadn't been looking for rescue. But 6 months later, she'd married a man whose kindness felt revolutionary after years of being treated like an expense Marcus was tired of carrying. And her life had transformed in ways that still felt impossible some mornings when she woke up. The apartment Marcus had asked Claire to leave so he could move his new girlfriend in was smaller than the closet in the home she now shared with Jonathan. The teacher salary he'd resented now funded a private foundation she ran, investing in exactly the kind of students she used to teach. The future he'd promised she couldn't access had opened wider than anything his ambition could have reached. But Claire hadn't changed who she was. She'd just finally found space to become who she'd always been underneath the smallness Marcus required. She still taught, now at a private academy where her students had resources that made education feel like possibility instead of triage. She still read the same books, wore comfortable clothes when she wasn't required to dress up, preferred quiet evenings to the kind of performative socializing Marcus had loved. The only difference was that now, when she moved through the world, she moved with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being seen completely and loved anyway. Jonathan's world had been an adjustment. The wealth was almost incomprehensible at first. Homes in 3 cities, staff who anticipated needs before you voiced them, technology that made everything effortless, security that made privacy possible. But what had surprised Claire most wasn't the luxury, it was the loneliness she'd discovered behind it. The way people performed around Jonathan, calculating what they could gain, measuring their words for maximum advantage. The way genuine connection became nearly impossible when everyone wanted something. He'd told her once, 3 months into dating, that he hadn't realized how exhausting performance was until he met someone who didn't require it. That Claire's complete lack of interest in his money had been more seductive than any amount of beauty or charm or strategic flattery. That being with someone who loved him for qualities that had nothing to do with his bank account felt like medicine for a sickness he hadn't known he was carrying. Their marriage was private, intentionally so. They'd signed papers in a judge's chamber with 2 witnesses and no press. Claire had kept her teaching job and her own name. Jonathan had kept his obsessive privacy, the kind that required NDAs and security protocols and a carefully managed public profile that revealed almost nothing personal. Most people who did business with Hamilton Capital Group had never seen a photograph of Jonathan's face, had no idea he was married, had no idea his wife was the quiet woman in modest clothes who sometimes sat in on meetings and asked questions that revealed how carefully she'd read their proposals. Marcus had spent 9 months pitching Hamilton Capital, trying to secure the investment that would save Hammond Solutions from the slow collapse that had started 18 months earlier. 9 months of emails and meetings with junior partners and revised presentations. 9 months of desperation that had made him sharp and mean, blaming everyone around him for failures that started with his own decisions. He'd never connected Claire to any of it. Why would he? The woman he'd divorced was a teacher. The wife of Jonathan Hamilton was a ghost, a name that never appeared in business journals, a presence so protected that even people who worked at Hamilton Capital weren't sure she existed. The possibility that they were the same person had never crossed his mind because Marcus had filed Claire away in a category marked irrelevant the moment he'd signed divorce papers. She was part of a past he'd outgrown, a chapter he'd closed, someone who existed in his memory only as evidence of how far he'd climbed from who he used to be. And that assumption, that fundamental certainty that Claire remained exactly where he'd left her, powerless and forgettable, was about to destroy everything he'd built. Marcus had been chasing the Hamilton Capital meeting for so long it had started to feel mythical. Every pitch had been promising. Every conversation had suggested they were close. But the final meeting, the one where Jonathan Hamilton himself would review the proposal and make a decision, had been perpetually rescheduled. Until this morning, until an email had arrived at 6 a.m. confirming the meeting for 9 a.m., with a tone that suggested this was his last opportunity to make an impression. Marcus had prepared obsessively, had rehearsed his presentation until every word felt inevitable, had bought a new suit because the one he owned suddenly looked cheap under the kind of scrutiny that 9 months of pursuit had built. He'd felt powerful driving to the meeting, felt like success was finally recognizing him. And when he'd seen Claire standing at that crosswalk, seen her looking small and ordinary and completely unchanged from the woman he'd left behind, something vicious had risen in his chest. The urge to humiliate her hadn't been rational. It had been instinctive, a need to mark the distance between who he was now and who he'd been when they were married, a need to punish her for representing a version of himself he wanted erased. So he'd aimed for the puddle, had watched the water arc perfectly, had savored her shock, had driven away feeling like he'd won something important. Beside him, Vanessa had been breathless with laughter, her phone capturing every second, already talking about how many views this would get if they posted it, and Marcus had felt nothing except satisfaction that burned clean and bright, the kind that comes from crushing something weak. Now, 47 minutes later, he stood in the lobby of Hamilton Capital Group, checking his reflection in polished marble, adjusting his tie, breathing slowly to channel adrenaline into focus instead of fear. Everything he'd worked for converged in the next hour. Everything he'd sacrificed, the relationships he'd ended, the bridges he'd burned, the money he'd borrowed against future success that hadn't materialized fast enough. All of it came down to one conversation with one man whose resources could resurrect Hammond Solutions from bankruptcy. Vanessa stood beside him, her excitement barely contained, her designer bag matching her dress, matching her shoes in the kind of coordination that required planning. She'd been dating Marcus for 2 years, had moved into his condo 18 months ago, had built her entire social media presence around being the girlfriend of an ambitious entrepreneur on the verge of breakthrough success. This meeting mattered to her almost as much as it mattered to him. The validation she'd invested in, the future she'd been promised, the status that would come when Marcus finally closed the deal that proved he belonged in rooms like this. They approached the reception desk, where a woman in a flawless suit smiled with professional warmth. Marcus gave his name, watched her fingers move across a keyboard, accepted the visitor badges she handed them. The executive elevator opened with a whisper of expensive engineering. Inside, mirrors multiplied their reflections into infinity. Marcus straightened his collar, checked his teeth, ran through his opening lines one final time. The numbers were solid, the market analysis was bulletproof, the growth projections were conservative enough to be credible, but ambitious enough to be exciting. He'd done everything right, prepared for every question, anticipated every objection. This was his moment. The elevator climbed in silence, numbers ticking upward on a digital display. Floor 20, floor 30, floor 38. Marcus's pulse was steady, controlled, the fear channeled into confidence because he'd learned years ago that success belonged to people who could perform certainty even when drowning in doubt. Vanessa squeezed his hand. "You're going to kill this." He smiled, believing her, believing himself, believing that the universe rewarded people who worked this hard for this long. The doors opened onto the 40th floor. Carpet so thick it swallowed sound. Art that belonged in museums, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the city spread out like a kingdom. A woman sat behind a desk of black glass, her expression professional and utterly neutral. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. "Mr. Hamilton is expecting you. Conference room A, last door on the left." Marcus nodded, his confidence building with every step. This was it, the moment everything changed. They reached the conference room, glass and steel, the letter A etched in elegant script at eye level. Marcus opened the door onto a space dominated by windows and a table that could seat 20 people. Leather chairs, technology embedded in every surface, views that made the city look like a toy arranged for someone's pleasure. A man stood at the far end, tall, expensive suit, silver at his temples, hands clasped behind his back as he studied the skyline. He didn't turn when they entered. "Mr. Hamilton," Marcus's voice carried appropriate respect. His shoulders tensed. Slowly, he turned to face them. His expression was controlled, giving away nothing except perhaps something cold gathering behind his eyes. "Mr. Carter," his voice was ice wrapped in courtesy. "Please, sit." Marcus moved forward, hand extended for the handshake that would begin everything, his smile confident because this was the moment he'd been chasing for 9 months. But Jonathan Hamilton didn't take his hand, didn't move toward the table, just stood there, perfectly still, studying Marcus with the kind of attention that suggested he saw more than most people wanted to reveal. "Before we proceed," Jonathan said quietly, "we're waiting for one more person." Marcus's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "I'm sorry, who?" "My wife," Jonathan said, as if this should have been obvious. "She's integral to all major investment decisions. Nothing moves forward without her input." Marcus forced his smile to stay steady, even as irritation flickered beneath the surface. Some billionaire's wife who probably knew nothing about business but wielded power through proximity. He'd dealt with this before. Wealthy men who let their spouses play executive to keep them entertained. Vanessa shifted beside him. "How wonderful that you include your wife in your business." Jonathan's eyes moved to her, cold and measuring. "My wife earned her position through competence, not marriage." The rebuke was subtle, but unmistakable. Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened. Claire stepped inside, still covered in mud, still dripping onto carpet that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. Her presence was so shocking in its devastation that for a moment nobody moved, nobody breathed. The room seemed to tilt sideways as reality rearranged itself into something none of them had prepared for. Jonathan crossed to her immediately, his controlled demeanor fracturing into something raw. "Claire!" His hands found her shoulders. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Her voice was quiet, steady, containing depths of emotion she was working to suppress. "My ex-husband splashed mud on me, deliberately, about 40 minutes ago." The words hung in the air like an explosion waiting to detonate. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes finding her face, really seeing her for the first time since she'd walked in, seeing past the mud to features he knew intimately. The woman he'd divorced 4 years ago. The woman he'd soaked with filthy water specifically because humiliating his mediocre ex-wife had felt like celebrating how far he'd risen above the life she represented. "Claire!" His voice cracked with disbelief. His brain couldn't process what he was seeing, couldn't reconcile the mud-covered teacher with the executive floor of Hamilton Capital Group, couldn't understand why she was here, in this room, in this moment that belonged to him. Vanessa's gasp was audible. "Wait, this is your ex-wife? The one you told me was teaching middle school in some public district?" Marcus was already standing, his chair scraping backward, professional composure shattering as shock gave way to outrage. "What are you doing here?" His voice rose, sharp and accusatory, the same contempt from the parking lot flooding back. "Did you follow me? Are you seriously that pathetic that you—" Claire's smile stopped him mid-sentence. It was a smile he'd never seen on her face during their 6 years of marriage. Dangerous, knowing, containing zero fear and something that looked almost like pity. "What am I doing here?" She repeated his question slowly. "What am I doing in my husband's company?" The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Vanessa's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the glass table. Jonathan's hand remained on Claire's shoulder, protective and possessive, his expression moving from concern to understanding to something that looked like carefully controlled rage. "Your husband's?" Marcus couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't make his brain accept what his ears were hearing. "My husband," Claire said, her voice perfectly calm. "Jonathan Hamilton. The man you've been desperately trying to impress for 9 months. The man whose investment is the only thing standing between Hammond Solutions and complete bankruptcy. The man you just met 30 seconds ago." Marcus's legs stopped working. He sat down hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table to stop the room from spinning. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. Claire, his boring ex-wife who taught English for poverty wages, couldn't be married to Jonathan Hamilton, couldn't have access to this kind of wealth, this kind of power, this kind of influence over everything Marcus had built. But she was here. She was standing in a conference room on the 40th floor, covered in mud he'd thrown at her, married to the man whose signature Marcus needed to survive. And suddenly, with perfect, horrifying clarity, Marcus understood that the splash hadn't just humiliated someone powerless, it had humiliated someone who'd been holding his entire future in her hands. Jonathan's jaw clenched. "Let me make absolutely sure I understand this correctly." His voice was quiet, controlled, which somehow made it more terrifying than shouting. "The man sitting in my conference room, asking for my investment, asking for my partnership, asking for my signature on a contract worth $50 million is the same man who deliberately splashed my wife with mud 40 minutes ago. The same man who told her to stay in her lane?" Marcus tried to speak, but his throat had closed completely. Beside him, Vanessa looked like she might be sick. Jonathan continued, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "The same man who stopped his car, reversed, positioned himself to make sure she saw him clearly, who wanted her to know the humiliation was intentional, who laughed while she stood there dripping filth onto a public sidewalk." "Mr. Hamilton," Marcus finally found his voice, hoarse and desperate, "please, let me explain. I didn't know she was your wife. I would never—" "You wouldn't what?" Claire's voice cut through his excuse like a blade. "You wouldn't deliberately humiliate someone if you thought they mattered? You wouldn't aim for that puddle if you'd known I was connected to someone important? You wouldn't tell me to stay in my lane if you'd realized I had power over your future?" Marcus's hands were shaking. "Claire, please, we were married for 6 years. That has to count for something." "It does count for something," she said quietly. "It counts as evidence of exactly who you are when you think there are no consequences. The man who divorced me the moment I stopped being useful. The man who erased me so completely from his memory that you could see me this morning and only recognize an opportunity for cruelty." Jonathan moved to the conference table, his posture radiating finality. "This meeting is over, Mr. Carter. Hamilton Capital will not be partnering with Hammond Solutions. Not now, not ever. You can't." Marcus lurched to his feet, desperation overwhelming every other instinct. "You can't make a $50 million decision based on one mistake, one moment of not thinking clearly. I can make whatever decision I choose." Jonathan's voice cut through the protest like steel. "And I choose not to invest in companies run by people whose character is so fundamentally compromised they celebrate causing pain. I choose not to do business with men who treat human beings as disposable. Mr. Hamilton, please," Marcus was begging now, all pretense of professionalism abandoned. "My company will collapse without this investment. 18 months of work, jobs, everything I've built. Everything you've built on the backs of people you deemed unworthy of basic respect," Claire said.
Her voice was steady, containing none of the anger Marcus might have expected. "People like me when I was supporting your dreams with my teacher salary. People like whoever you've stepped on since then to get where you are. People you only see as valuable when they can do something for you." Marcus's vision was blurring. He could feel everything slipping away, could see his future collapsing in real time because he'd chosen cruelty over decency 40 minutes ago. Vanessa grabbed his arm. "Marcus, let's just go. Let's get out of here." But Marcus couldn't move, couldn't process that this was really happening, that 9 months of pursuit, 18 months of struggling to keep Hammond's solutions alive, 4 years of building something he thought mattered, was evaporating because he'd wanted to feel superior for 5 seconds. "Security will escort you out," Jonathan said, his tone suggesting the conversation was finished. "And Mr. Carter, if I were you, I'd prepare for other investors to reconsider their positions. Word travels quickly in our circles. By tomorrow morning, everyone who matters will know exactly what kind of man you are." The threat landed like a death sentence. Marcus's knees buckled, but Vanessa caught him, her own face pale with the realization that the video on her phone, the evidence of their morning entertainment, might become the thing that destroyed them both. Claire watched them stumble toward the door, her expression unreadable, her mud-covered clothes a testament to cruelty meeting consequence in exactly the right place. The conference room door closed behind them with a whisper of expensive engineering. Marcus and Vanessa stood in the hallway, the thick carpet swallowing sound, the silence pressing in from all sides. Around them, Hamilton Capital continued operating, people moving through corridors with purpose and efficiency, completely unaware that 2 visitors had just lost everything in the span of 10 minutes. The elevator arrived. They stepped inside, and as the doors closed and the numbers counted down floor by floor, back to ground level, Marcus finally understood that some bridges, once burned with deliberate cruelty, can never be rebuilt, no matter how desperately you need to cross back to the other side. Vanessa didn't speak on the elevator ride down, didn't speak when they walked through the lobby, didn't speak until they reached the parking garage where the Mercedes waited, still gleaming, still perfect, carrying no evidence of what they'd done except the memory burning in both their minds. She turned to Marcus, her face pale. "That video, the one I took, I need to delete it." Marcus nodded, numb. "Delete it. Delete everything." But they both knew deletion wouldn't matter, wouldn't change what had happened, wouldn't erase the fact that Marcus had recognized his ex-wife, aimed for that puddle, and celebrated her humiliation, while the woman who controlled his future watched from inside a building he'd been too arrogant to notice. Vanessa's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. "This is really bad, Marcus. If this gets out, if people find out what we did—" "It won't get out," Marcus said, but his voice carried no conviction. Jonathan Hamilton had promised that by tomorrow morning, everyone who mattered would know exactly what kind of man he was.
And men like Jonathan Hamilton didn't make empty threats. They drove in silence back to the condo Marcus could no longer afford, the same condo he'd moved into after divorcing Claire, the same space he'd filled with furniture bought on credit against success that kept almost arriving but never quite landing. Vanessa disappeared into the bedroom without a word. Marcus stood in his living room, staring at nothing, his mind running through the conversation over and over, searching for the moment where he could have saved it, the words that might have changed Jonathan Hamilton's mind. But there was no such moment, no magic phrase that could undo deliberate cruelty, no explanation that would make splashing someone with mud and telling them to stay in their lane look like anything other than what it was. His phone buzzed, an email from his CFO. 3 investors pulling out, citing concerns about leadership and character. Marcus's hands went cold. It had been less than 2 hours since the meeting, less than 2 hours, and Jonathan Hamilton had already made good on his promise. Word was spreading. The story was traveling through networks Marcus had spent years trying to access. By the next morning, Marcus had lost 6 more investors. By the afternoon, his board had called an emergency meeting.
By evening, Hammond Solutions' remaining clients were requesting calls to discuss concerns about stability and leadership. The collapse wasn't dramatic. There was no single catastrophic moment, just a steady erosion of trust, opportunity, and possibility. Just phone calls that went unreturned, meetings that got canceled, partnerships that quietly dissolved, just the slow, methodical destruction of everything Marcus had built, brick by brick, relationship by relationship, until the company he'd sacrificed his marriage to create existed only on paper, with debt he couldn't pay and a reputation he couldn't repair. 3 months later, Hammond Solutions filed for bankruptcy. Marcus had to sell the condo, the car, everything he'd bought to perform success, had to move into a studio apartment that reminded him of the place Claire had lived in after their divorce, had to take a job working for someone else's company, reporting to someone else's vision, accepting a salary that barely covered expenses. Vanessa had left him 6 weeks after the meeting, had packed her things while he was at work and moved in with someone else, someone whose future looked more promising, someone who hadn't destroyed his own life with one moment of casual cruelty. And Marcus was alone, truly alone in a way he'd never been before. Not the productive solitude of ambition, but the hollow isolation of knowing that everyone who'd mattered had seen exactly who he was when the masks came off, and they'd all walked away. He thought about Claire constantly, not with longing or regret about the divorce, but with the haunting recognition that he'd never really seen her, had never understood that the quietness he'd mistaken for weakness was actually strength, that the steadiness he'd found boring was actually integrity, that the woman he'd dismissed as unambitious had simply had different values, values that apparently led to the kind of life he'd destroyed himself chasing. 6 months after the bankruptcy, Marcus saw an article about a literacy program funded by the Hamilton Foundation. There was a photo of Claire, not covered in mud, but professional and confident, standing with students whose lives her work had changed. She looked happy, not the performance of happiness, but the real thing, the kind that comes from building something that matters. Marcus stared at that photo for a long time, trying to remember if she'd ever looked that way during their marriage, trying to pinpoint the exact moment he'd decided her dreams were smaller than his, that her work was less important, that she was an obstacle to the future he deserved. He couldn't find that moment, because it hadn't been one decision. It had been 1,000 small choices. 1,000 times he'd prioritized his comfort over her dignity. 1,000 conversations where he'd talked and she'd listened, and he'd never once asked what she wanted. 1,000 days of taking her support for granted while resenting that she wasn't someone else. And now she was someone else, not because she'd changed fundamentally, but because she'd finally found space to be who she'd always been, underneath the smallness his ego had required. Marcus closed the article, turned off his phone, sat in his studio apartment that smelled like someone else's cooking and cost half his salary, and for the first time since the divorce, he let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost. Not the company, not the money, not the status, but the knowledge that he'd had something real once, something valuable, and he'd thrown it away because he'd confused kindness with weakness and patience with irrelevance. Meanwhile, Claire continued building the life she'd created. She still taught, still read the same books, still preferred quiet evenings to performative socializing, but she moved through the world differently now, with the kind of confidence that comes from being seen completely and loved anyway, from knowing that her worth wasn't determined by someone else's assessment of her usefulness, from understanding that the right person wouldn't require her to shrink. Jonathan had asked her once, a year into their marriage, if she'd ever wanted revenge on Marcus, if seeing him lose everything had brought her satisfaction. Claire had thought about it carefully before answering. She told him the truth. that watching Marcus destroy himself hadn't brought her joy, that she'd never wanted him to suffer, that all she'd ever wanted was for him to see that the cruelty he chose had consequences, that treating people as disposable eventually leaves you alone with nothing but your own reflection, and that sometimes the universe doesn't need our intervention. Sometimes it just needs time and space for people to reveal who they really are when they think nobody important is watching. The question you need to ask yourself is this: when you move through the world, when you interact with people you believe have nothing to offer you, when you encounter someone you've decided doesn't matter, how do you treat them? Do you choose kindness even when there's no advantage? Do you offer dignity even when there's no audience? Do you recognize that every person you meet is carrying a story you don't understand, holding power you haven't discovered, connected to futures you can't predict? Or do you aim for the puddle? Do you choose cruelty because it feels like winning? Do you humiliate people who can't fight back because making someone else smaller temporarily makes you feel larger? Because here's what Marcus learned too late. Power isn't always loud, success isn't always visible, and the person you dismiss today might be the person holding your future tomorrow. The woman you splash with mud might be married to the man whose signature you need to survive. The quiet teacher you divorce might build an empire of impact that dwarfs anything your ambition could reach. The people you step on while climbing might be the ones who decide whether you land safely or fall completely when the climb inevitably ends.
This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about consequence, about character revealed in moments when we think nobody important is looking, about the reality that in our hyper-connected world, there's no such thing as a private cruelty. Someone is always watching. Someone always remembers, and eventually, past and present collide in rooms where all the power we thought we had suddenly belongs to someone else. Marcus chose to humiliate Claire because he believed she was powerless. He was wrong. Not because she'd married someone wealthy, though that detail certainly mattered in the specific consequences he faced. He was wrong because power doesn't only come from money or status or position. It comes from integrity, from treating people with dignity regardless of what they can do for you, from understanding that character isn't what you perform for important people. It's what you choose when you think there are no consequences. Claire had always had that power. Marcus had just been too arrogant to see it, and by the time he recognized what he'd missed, it was far too late to matter. So, let me ask you directly. If you were Claire, standing in that conference room covered in mud, holding all the power over the person who just tried to destroy you for entertainment, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy? Would you have chosen justice? Would you have let him face the natural consequences of his own cruelty? And if you've ever been on the other side, if you've ever been the person who underestimated someone, who dismissed someone as irrelevant, who chose cruelty because you thought you could get away with it, what did you learn when the truth revealed itself? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from. Share what this story made you feel. And if you found yourself thinking about someone in your own life, someone you've underestimated, or someone who underestimated you, tell us that story too. Because these narratives, these moments where power shifts and consequences arrive, aren't just entertainment. They're mirrors, reflecting back the choices we make every single day about who we decide to be when we think nobody's keeping score. Subscribe if stories like this matter to you, if you believe that character counts, if you want to be reminded that dignity always, always outlasts arrogance. Because the next story might hit even closer to home.